Victoria Bennett stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, watching the London skyline shimmer in the early morning light. At Millionaire woman pretended to be a dishwasher, and her fiancé's family treated her like that. 32, she had achieved what many considered impossible, building tech vision solutions into a 500 million company from scratch. Yet here she was, plotting what might be her riskiest venture yet, going undercover as a kitchen worker in her boyfriend's family home. She adjusted her designer blazer and turned to face her reflection in the polished surface of her desk. Thomas had been different from the start, genuine, kind, and refreshingly unimpressed by her success. 6 months into their relationship, he still hadn't told his family about her professional achievements, respecting her wish to be known for who she was rather than what she owned. "Ms. Bennett, the board members are ready for you," her assistant Sarah announced through the intercom. Victoria straightened her shoulders and strode into the conference room, where 8 expectant faces greeted her. "Good morning, everyone. I've called this meeting to discuss our leadership structure during my upcoming absence." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of presentations and delegations. Victoria had prepared meticulously for this moment, assigning key responsibilities to her executive team and scheduling all crucial meetings for after her return. The cover story was simple: a strategic business trip to evaluate potential expansion opportunities. Back in her office, Victoria opened her laptop and began her final preparations. She had chosen Sheffield for her undercover mission, a city where tech vision had minimal presence. Her research into domestic work had been thorough, though she harbored no illusions about her practical experience. The plan had crystallized 3 weeks ago, after a particularly revealing phone conversation with Thomas. He'd mentioned his family's struggles with household staff retention, and Victoria had recognized an opportunity. A few careful inquiries through a temporary employment agency, and she had secured a position at the Harrison family mansion, contingent on a trial period, of course. Victoria opened her wardrobe where she'd hidden a carefully curated selection of simple, worn clothing. She'd sourced them from charity shops, ensuring they looked lived in, but clean. Her designer wardrobe and sophisticated appearance would be replaced by something altogether different. She picked up her mobile and dialed Thomas's number, smiling as his familiar voice answered. "Hi, darling. Just wanted to let you know I'll be quite busy with work travel for the next few weeks. Reception might be spotty. Everything all right?" The concern in his voice made her heart twist. "Absolutely. Just some potential new markets to explore." "How's Singapore treating you?" "Hot and busy. The merger's taking longer than expected. I might not be back for another 3 weeks." "Perfect timing," Victoria murmured, then caught herself. "I mean, that works well with my schedule too. We can catch up properly when we're both back." After ending the call, Victoria began methodically removing her rings and expensive watch. She studied her reflection as she swept her long brown hair into a simple ponytail. The transformation had begun. That evening, as her employees filed out of the building, Victoria remained in her office, finalizing the last details. She'd created a separate mobile number for her undercover identity, arranged for her mail to be handled discreetly, and set up emergency protocols with Sarah, the only person who knew her true plans. As night fell over London, Victoria gathered her things: a small suitcase containing her modest new wardrobe, a basic phone, and the carefully crafted backstory of Victoria Smith, a woman seeking temporary work while getting back on her feet. Her usual confident stride softened into something more uncertain as she practiced her new persona. In the underground car park, she bypassed her usual spot where her luxury vehicle sat. Instead, she approached a modest used car she'd purchased specifically for this purpose. As she settled into the worn driver's seat, Victoria took a deep breath, allowing herself one last moment of doubt. The stakes were high. If her plan succeeded, she would gain invaluable insight into Thomas's family dynamics and their true character. If it failed, well, she'd built her career on calculated risks. This was simply another one, albeit of a more personal nature. Victoria started the engine, its gentle rumble a far cry from her usual vehicle's purr. As she navigated through London's evening traffic, she mentally rehearsed her cover story one final time. In less than 24 hours, she would arrive at the Harrison family mansion, not as Victoria Bennett, the successful CEO, but as Victoria Smith, their new kitchen helper. The streetlights cast intermittent shadows across her face as she drove, each one marking another step away from her familiar world and towards something entirely unknown. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of her greatest performance yet, one where the script was unwritten and the consequences all too real. The Harrison mansion loomed before Victoria, its Georgian architecture a statement of old money and established power. She parked her modest car at the end of the gravel driveway, deliberately far from the main entrance. The morning air carried a slight chill as she straightened her simple cotton blouse and checked her reflection in the car window one last time. Gone were the subtle highlights in her hair, replaced by a natural brown tied back in a practical bun. Her carefully maintained nails were now short and unpolished, and her face bore only the slightest touch of makeup. The transformation was remarkable. Even Thomas might struggle to recognize her at first glance. Victoria approached the service entrance, her heart pounding beneath her calm exterior. She'd memorized the layout from public renovation records: kitchen and staff areas in the east wing, family rooms in the main house, guest quarters above. She rang the bell, adjusting the worn shoulder bag that contained her few belongings. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, her grey-streaked hair neatly pinned back, wearing a practical black dress with a white apron. "You must be Victoria Smith," she said, her tone businesslike but not unkind. "I'm Mrs. Phillips, the housekeeper. Come in then." Victoria followed Mrs. Phillips through a narrow corridor into a large, well-equipped kitchen. The smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee filled the air. An older woman stood at the industrial-sized range, stirring something in a large pot. "This is Mrs. Walker, our cook," Mrs. Phillips introduced. "She's been with the family for 20 years. You'll be working closely with her." Mrs. Walker turned, revealing a round, pleasant face and keen eyes that seemed to notice everything. "Welcome, dear. I hope you know your way around a kitchen." Victoria nodded, perhaps too eagerly. "I've worked in various settings," she said, carefully vague, "though perhaps not quite so grand as this." "Well, we'll soon see what you can do," Mrs. Walker replied, her Yorkshire accent warm but practical. "First task, help me prepare breakfast for the family. They'll be down in 45 minutes. The next hour proved more challenging than any board meeting Victoria had ever faced. She struggled with the industrial-grade coffee machine, nearly scalded herself while preparing porridge, and dropped a stack of plates that thankfully turned out to be plastic prepware. Mrs. Walker watched it all with remarkable patience. "Nervous hands, dear?" she asked kindly, showing Victoria the correct way to carry a loaded serving tray. "Don't worry, we all start somewhere." Just as Victoria was mastering the basics of breakfast service, the kitchen door swung open. A woman in her early 60s entered, dressed immaculately in a designer outfit that Victoria recognized from last season's collection. Margaret Harrison, Thomas's mother, surveyed the kitchen with sharp eyes. "Mrs. Phillips, is this the new girl?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was referring to a piece of furniture rather than a person. "Yes, madam. This is Victoria Smith here on trial from the agency." Margaret's gaze swept over Victoria, taking in her simple clothing and unadorned appearance. "Well, let's hope you last longer than the last one. We can't have the staff changing every few weeks. It upsets the entire household routine." Victoria lowered her eyes, fighting the urge to stand straighter. "I'll do my best, madam," she murmured, adopting the slight northern accent she'd practiced. "See that you do. And do something about that hair, it's coming loose. We maintain certain standards here." With that, Margaret turned and left, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Mrs. Walker waited until the door closed before patting Victoria's arm. "Don't take it personally, dear. She's like that with everyone at first. Now let's get these breakfast trays ready. Mr. Harrison will want his newspaper ironed." "Ironed?" Victoria couldn't hide her surprise. "Oh yes, can't have the paper creasing while he reads it, can we?" Mrs. Walker's eyes twinkled with gentle amusement. "I'll show you how. There's a lot to learn, but you seem clever enough." Throughout the morning, Victoria observed the household's rhythm. The staff moved with practiced efficiency, anticipating needs before they arose. She watched Mrs. Walker masterfully manage multiple tasks while teaching her the basics, and Mrs. Phillips orchestrate the household with military precision. By lunchtime, Victoria's feet ached, her hands were red from hot water, and she'd made countless minor mistakes. Yet she felt oddly exhilarated. This was a world as complex and demanding as any corporate environment, just with different rules and hierarchies. As she scrubbed pots under Mrs. Walker's guidance, Victoria thought about Thomas. Would he approve of her methods? Probably not. But something told her this experience would reveal more about his family than years of formal visits ever could. "You're holding that scouring pad like it might bite you," Mrs. Walker observed, demonstrating the correct technique. "But you're willing to learn, and that's what matters. Though I must say your hands look like they've never seen a day's hard work before." Victoria glanced down at her softened nails and slowly callousing palms. "I've been doing office work recently," she explained carefully, "but I'm ready for something different." Mrs. Walker nodded sagely. "Well, you'll certainly find something different here. Just remember, in this house, we see everything but say nothing. That's the first rule of service." As Victoria continued her tasks, she couldn't help but appreciate the irony. In her real life, she managed hundreds of employees and made decisions affecting thousands more. Here she couldn't even be trusted to prepare tea without supervision, yet somehow, this felt like her most important assignment yet. Victoria's first week at the Harrison household proved more challenging than launching her company. Each morning brought new lessons in humility, starting with the 5 a.m. wake-up call to begin breakfast preparations. "The tea must be precisely 98 degrees for Mr. Harrison," Mrs. Walker explained one morning, watching Victoria measure the temperature. "And Mrs. Harrison prefers her toast done on setting 4, not 5. There's a world of difference." Victoria found herself taking mental notes with the same intensity she once reserved for board meetings. Her mobile phone hidden beneath her pillow in the small staff bedroom, filled with reminders. Fold napkins in thirds, not halves. Polish silver before and after use. Never let the sugar bowl fall below half full. The Harrison family's youngest daughter, Elizabeth, proved particularly demanding. At 24, she spent her days managing her social media presence and criticizing the staff's efforts. "This juice isn't fresh enough," Elizabeth complained one morning, pushing away her glass. "I can taste that it was squeezed last night rather than this morning." Victoria bit her tongue, remembering how she'd risen extra early to squeeze those oranges. Mrs. Walker stepped in smoothly. "I'll prepare a fresh glass right away, Miss Elizabeth." Later, in the kitchen, Mrs. Walker offered some wisdom. The young miss wasn't always like this. She changed after university, started comparing herself to her friends' families, always wanting more. Satisfaction, you'll find, is rarely about the juice. The household's patriarch, Richard Harrison, barely acknowledged the staff's existence. He moved through the house like a ghost, leaving instructions through Mrs. Phillips and expecting them to be carried out invisibly. His study remained strictly off-limits to everyone except Mrs. Phillips, who dusted it precisely at 3 p.m. each day while he took his afternoon walk. Victoria's corporate training proved surprisingly useful in navigating the complex social dynamics below stairs. The kitchen staff operated with its own rigid hierarchy, unwritten rules and power structures. Just as in the business world alliances mattered, she found an unexpected ally in Jenny, the young gardener's assistant, who shared local gossip during their brief tea breaks. "The last girl left because of Miss Elizabeth," Jenny whispered one afternoon. "Couldn't take the criticism, but Mrs. Walker says you're made of sterner stuff." The compliment warmed Victoria, though it came with a twinge of guilt. These people had accepted her, shared their world with her, all while believing in her carefully constructed facade. One afternoon, while polishing silverware, Victoria overheard a conversation between Margaret and Elizabeth in the adjacent dining room. "Thomas is bringing his new girlfriend to dinner when he returns," Margaret said, her tone disapproving. "Apparently she runs some sort of computer company." "Is she at least from a good family?" Elizabeth asked. "He won't say much about her background. Probably another one of his charitable cases. Remember that teacher he dated 2 years ago? Complete disaster." Victoria focused intently on a particularly stubborn water spot, her cheeks burning. She'd known the family held traditional views, but hearing them discussed so dismissively still stung. Mrs. Walker appeared beside her, gently taking the silver piece from her hands. "You're going to wear a hole in that poor spoon," she said kindly. "Come help me with the dinner preparations instead." In the kitchen's warm embrace, Victoria found herself relaxing. Mrs. Walker worked with quiet efficiency, showing Victoria how to prepare the evening's sophisticated menu. "The family might run this house," she said, demonstrating the proper way to chop herbs. But the kitchen is my domain. Here, we judge people by their actions, not their background. That evening, as Victoria served dinner, she observed the family dynamics with new eyes. Richard barely looked up from his phone, responding to Margaret's attempts at conversation with distracted grunts. Elizabeth complained about the wine temperature, while her mother critiqued the new neighbor's garden renovations. Yet Victoria noticed other things too, how Margaret's hand trembled slightly when discussing Thomas's extended absence, the worry lines around Richard's eyes when he read certain emails, Elizabeth's longing glance at old family photos in the hallway. Later, in her small room, Victoria checked her work phone. Dozens of emails awaited her attention, but she found herself more preoccupied with her growing understanding of Thomas's world. The distance between their upbringings suddenly seemed vast, yet somehow less important than the distance between who his family appeared to be and who they really were. As she drifted off to sleep, Victoria wondered if Thomas saw these same complexities in his family. Did he notice how his mother's criticism masked her fear of losing control? How his father's distance reflected his own struggles with emotional connection? How his sister's demands for perfection stemmed from a deep-seated insecurity? The answers, she suspected, lay in the quiet moments between the grand displays, in the subtle interactions and unspoken tensions that only someone below stairs could truly observe. The announcement came during morning breakfast service. The Harrisons would host a dinner party for 20 of Richard's most important business associates. Victoria watched Margaret's face light up with the prospect of orchestrating a perfect evening. "Everything must be immaculate," Margaret announced to the assembled staff. "The Caldwells, the Petersons, and the Whitworths will all be attending. Mrs. Phillips, ensure the silver is polished twice. Mrs. Walker, we'll need your signature soufflé." The kitchen transformed into a command center, with Mrs. Walker directing operations like a seasoned general. Victoria found herself assigned to increasingly complex tasks, her week of training accelerated by necessity. "You'll help serve the main course," Mrs. Walker informed her. "Your hands have steadied nicely this past week. Just remember, serve from the left, clear from the right, and stay invisible unless needed." The day of the dinner party arrived with military precision. Victoria helped polish every surface until it gleamed, arranged flowers according to Margaret's exact specifications, and memorized the dietary restrictions of each guest. As evening approached, Victoria changed into the formal black dress required for dinner service. The outfit reminded her of her own evening wear, though this version scratched at her neck and pulled awkwardly across her shoulders. "Remember," Mrs. Phillips instructed the serving staff, "the first course must be cleared within exactly 12 minutes of service. Not 11, not 13, 12. Victoria positioned herself in the service line, watching the guests arrive through the kitchen door's window. She recognized several faces from business magazines and charity galas she'd attended in her other life. The surreal nature of her situation struck her anew. The soup course proceeded smoothly, with Victoria managing to serve and clear without incident. However, as she carried a tray of main course plates through the swinging kitchen door, disaster struck. Another server backed into her path suddenly, causing Victoria to swerve. The tray tilted, and although she prevented the plates from falling, a splash of scalding sauce caught her forearm. Victoria bit back a cry of pain, her CEO instincts kicking in as she maintained her composure. But Mrs. Walker's sharp eyes missed nothing. "Let me see that arm," she insisted, pulling Victoria aside. The burn was already beginning to blister. Margaret chose that moment to enter the kitchen. "Why isn't the main course being served? We can't keep the Whitworths waiting." "The new girl's burned herself, madam," Mrs. Phillips reported. "Perhaps she should seek medical—" "Nonsense," Margaret cut in. "It's just a small burn. The service must continue. We can deal with minor injuries later." Richard appeared behind his wife. "Is everything all right? The guests are getting restless." "Just a slight kitchen accident," Margaret replied. "Nothing to concern yourself with." Victoria straightened her shoulders, ignoring the throbbing pain. "I can continue, madam," she said quietly. Richard frowned slightly, but Margaret was already turning away. "Good. Mrs. Phillips, do make sure the wine is served at precisely the right temperature this time." After they left, Mrs. Walker pulled Victoria aside again. "I've got some burn cream in my quarters. It'll have to do for now. But first, let me wrap that properly." Despite the pain, Victoria completed her serving duties, She noticed Richard watching her occasionally, a puzzled expression on his face, as though trying to place something familiar about her. Later that evening, as the guests departed, Victoria overheard snippets of conversation while clearing champagne flutes. "Magnificent evening, Margaret," Mrs. Whitworth gushed. "Your staff is so well trained. One hardly notices them at all." "Yes, though good help is increasingly hard to find," Margaret replied. "The younger generation simply doesn't understand the value of service." In the kitchen, Mrs. Walker quietly dressed Victoria's burn with professional efficiency. "You handled that well," she said softly. "Most would have rushed off to the emergency room." "I've dealt with worse," Victoria replied, thinking of the countless crises she'd managed at Tech Vision. "Have you now?" Mrs. Walker's eyes twinkled knowingly. "You know, dear, you hold yourself differently from most kitchen staff, almost like someone used to giving orders rather than taking them." Victoria felt her heart skip a beat, but Mrs. Walker merely continued applying the burn cream. "Still, you've got a good heart. That counts for more than where you came from." That night, lying in her narrow bed, Victoria studied her bandaged arm. The incident had revealed volumes about the family dynamics. Margaret's rigid prioritization of appearances, Richard's underlying concern constrained by his wife's dominance, the staff's quiet solidarity. She thought of Thomas, imagining his reaction if he knew about her injury. Would he have challenged his mother's dismissal of it? The Thomas she knew would have insisted on proper medical attention, regardless of any dinner party. As she drifted off to sleep, Victoria realized that her undercover mission was revealing more than just the Harrison family's true nature. It was testing her own character in ways she hadn't anticipated. The days following the dinner party brought subtle changes to the Harrison household. Richard lingered longer in the kitchen during his morning coffee, watching the staff with newfound curiosity. Victoria noticed his gaze following her occasionally, though he never addressed her directly. Mrs. Walker's burn treatment had worked wonders, but Victoria's injury still required daily attention. During these quiet moments in the kitchen's pantry, the experienced cook shared insights about the family that went beyond mere gossip. "It wasn't always like this," Mrs. Walker confided one morning while changing Victoria's bandage. "When Thomas was young, this kitchen was full of laughter. Mrs. Harrison would even bake with the children sometimes." "What changed?" Victoria asked, carefully maintaining her role as a newcomer. "Success has its price, dear. Mr. Harrison's business grew, and suddenly appearances became everything. The simple joy of family meals turned into networking opportunities. Even young Thomas felt the pressure." Victoria absorbed this information, thinking of Thomas's discomfort at formal business functions. His reluctance to discuss his family's wealth made more sense now. One afternoon, while Victoria polished silverware in the dining room, Elizabeth entered, absorbed in her mobile phone. She paused, looking up at Victoria with an unusual expression. "That burn at the dinner party," Elizabeth said hesitantly. "Is it healing properly?" Surprised by the show of concern, Victoria nodded. "Yes, miss. Mrs. Walker has been very helpful with the treatment." Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably. "I heard you continued serving even after it happened. That was impressive." Before Victoria could respond, Margaret's voice rang out from the hallway. Elizabeth quickly resumed her phone-scrolling pose, all traces of compassion vanishing from her expression. Later that week, Victoria was dusting the library when she discovered a photo album tucked behind newer books. Inside, she found images of a younger, smiling Margaret teaching a small Thomas to bake cookies. Elizabeth, barely a toddler, sat on their father's shoulders, both laughing freely. "Ancient history now," came Mrs. Phillips's quiet voice behind her. Victoria startled, nearly dropping the album. "Mrs. Harrison used to say, 'Happiness was found in the simple things.' Now she searches for it in perfect table settings and social connections." Victoria carefully returned the album. People can change back, can't they? With the right reminder of what truly matters. Perhaps. Mrs. Phillips straightened a nearby vase. Though sometimes pride makes the journey back harder than the journey away. That evening, while serving dinner, Victoria observed the family with new understanding. Behind Margaret's rigid posture, she saw traces of the joyful mother from the photographs. Elizabeth's constant phone checking seemed less like arrogance and more like a shield against the formal atmosphere. Richard broke the silence halfway through the meal. "I've been thinking about Thomas's girlfriend coming to visit." Margaret's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Oh? Perhaps we should make her feel welcome. After all, Thomas speaks highly of her accomplishments. Elizabeth looked up from her phone. Is it true she built her company from nothing? Not quite nothing, Margaret interjected. I'm sure she had. Advantages we don't know about. Victoria focused intently on refilling water glasses, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Actually, Richard continued, I looked into her company, Tech Vision Solutions. Quite impressive growth over the past 5 years. The Innovation Awards alone. Innovation doesn't equal refinement, Margaret cut in. Besides, Thomas needs someone who understands our world, our traditions. Our world is changing, Margaret, Richard replied quietly. Maybe it's time we changed with it. The tension at the table was palpable. Victoria retreated to the kitchen, where Mrs. Walker was preparing dessert. Everything all right, dear? You look a bit pale. Victoria managed a small smile. Just tired, I suppose. Mrs. Walker patted her shoulder. Rest those hands a moment. I've got something to show you. She led Victoria to a small alcove where the staff took their breaks. Pinned to the wall was a newspaper clipping about Tech Vision Solutions. Victoria's own face smiled from the photograph. Quite remarkable, wouldn't you say? Mrs. Walker's eyes twinkled. A young woman building such a successful company. Reminds me of someone I know. Someone who's been learning to wash dishes despite having hands more suited to signing contracts. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. Mrs. Walker merely smiled and returned to her cooking, leaving Victoria to wonder just how many of her secrets the observant cook had uncovered. The atmosphere in the Harrison household grew increasingly tense as Thomas's return date approached. Victoria found herself at the center of an unspoken power shift, though few understood why. Richard began taking his morning coffee in the kitchen, something Margaret quietly disapproved of. He asked questions about the staff's lives, their families, their aspirations. Victoria watched as Mrs. Walker and Mrs. Phillips cautiously adjusted to this new dynamic. Tell me, Richard asked one morning, addressing Victoria directly for the first time, what made you choose this line of work? Victoria measured her response carefully. Sometimes the best way to understand people is to see them as they truly are, sir. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. Interesting perspective for a kitchen helper. Before he could probe further, Elizabeth burst into the kitchen unusually early for her standard noon appearance. Father, you won't believe what I found. She thrust her tablet forward, displaying a business magazine's website. Thomas's girlfriend, she's featured in the 30 under 30 list. Her company's developing some revolutionary artificial intelligence system. Victoria busied herself with the dishes, her heart pounding. Indeed, Richard smiled. Perhaps you should share that with your mother. Elizabeth's excitement dimmed. She doesn't want to hear it. She's too busy planning ways to test this woman when she arrives. Later that day, Victoria overheard Margaret and Mrs. Phillips discussing table arrangements for Thomas's return dinner. We'll use the second best china, Margaret declared. No need to bring out the finest pieces until we've properly assessed her background. Mrs. Phillips cleared her throat. If I may, madam, Mr. Thomas seems quite serious about this young lady. All the more reason to ensure she meets our standards. Margaret's tone brooked no argument. In the kitchen, Mrs. Walker watched Victoria's reaction to these conversations with knowing eyes. During their evening cleaning routine, she finally spoke up. You know, dear, I once knew a young woman who challenged everyone's expectations. Came from a simple background but built something remarkable. People judged her too, until they realized that true worth isn't about where you come from, but what you do with where you're going. Victoria paused in her work. Did she prove them wrong? She's still working on it, Mrs. Walker smiled, glancing meaningfully at Victoria's bandaged arm. But she's shown more grace under pressure than most who were born to privilege. That evening, as Victoria prepared for bed, her work phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. Landing tomorrow evening. Can't wait to see you once you're back from your business trip. Miss you. She stared at the screen, reality crashing in. Tomorrow would change everything. The carefully constructed world she'd built over the past weeks would shatter, revealing truths that could either heal or break this family forever. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Elizabeth stood at her door, looking uncertain. I wanted to apologize, she said quietly. About your burn. I should have said something when it happened. Victoria invited her in, surprised by this late visit. "I've been reading about Thomas's girlfriend," Elizabeth continued, perching awkwardly on Victoria's small chair. "She sounds amazing, but Mother's determined to find fault with her. I'm worried Thomas will never forgive us if we drive her away." "Why does your mother's approval matter so much?" Victoria asked gently. Elizabeth sighed. "You don't understand. Everything here is about maintaining perfect appearances. One wrong move and—" She gestured vaguely. "Sometimes I wish I could just be myself without worrying about every little detail." "Perhaps your brother feels the same way," Victoria suggested. Elizabeth studied her curiously. "You know, you don't talk like most of the staff. You remind me of—" "Never mind." She stood abruptly. "I should go. Mother doesn't approve of us socializing with the staff." After Elizabeth left, Victoria sat on her bed, contemplating the complexities of the situation. Tomorrow Thomas would return, and her true identity would be revealed. But perhaps more important than the revelation itself would be its impact on this family caught between tradition and change, appearance and authenticity. She touched her healing burn, remembering Margaret's dismissal, Richard's concern, Elizabeth's delayed guilt, and Mrs. Walker's quiet support. Each reaction had revealed something essential about their characters, truths that went deeper than social status or family tradition. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Victoria wondered if Thomas would understand why she'd gone to such lengths to truly know his family. Tomorrow would bring answers, but for now she was grateful for these weeks that had shown her both the flaws and the potential in the Harrison household. The morning of Thomas's return brought a frenzy of activity to the Harrison household. Margaret supervised every detail of the welcome dinner preparation, from the precise angle of the cutlery to the height of the flower arrangements. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she pressed the tablecloth, knowing these were her final hours of pretense. Mrs. Walker noticed her unsteadiness and quietly took over the task. "Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we need most," she murmured, smoothing the fabric with practiced strokes. By mid-afternoon, the house hummed with anticipation. Elizabeth paced the hallways, alternating between checking her phone and adjusting her outfit. Richard remained in his study, though Victoria noticed him glancing at the driveway more frequently than usual. "He'll be here at 6, Margaret announced to the staff. "Everything must be perfect." "Victoria, you'll serve the main course. Mrs. Walker has praised your improved skills." Victoria nodded, wondering how this same scene would play out once her identity was revealed. She caught Mrs. Walker watching her with a mixture of sympathy and encouragement. At 5:30, Victoria retreated to the kitchen to help with final preparations. Her heart nearly stopped when she heard a car pulling up, early by nearly 30 minutes. Through the kitchen window, she watched Thomas step out of a taxi. He looked tired but happy, his casual elegance unchanged by travel. Victoria instinctively stepped back from the window, though she knew he couldn't see her through the reflected sunset. The house erupted in greetings. Victoria heard Margaret's controlled enthusiasm, Elizabeth's genuine squeal of delight, and Richard's warm welcome. Then Thomas's voice, so familiar it made her chest ache, asking about his girlfriend. "She's still away on business," Margaret replied smoothly. "But never mind that now, Mrs. Walker has prepared all your favorites." "Actually, Mother, I tried calling Victoria earlier today. Her office said she wasn't on any business trip." Victoria froze in the middle of arranging dinner rolls. Through the kitchen door, she could hear the conversation continuing in the hallway. "What do you mean?" Margaret's voice sharpened. "Surely there must be some mistake." "That's what I thought," Thomas replied, his tone concerned. "But when I called her mobile, it went straight to voicemail. It's not like her to be unreachable." Victoria took a deep breath. The moment had arrived sooner than she'd planned, but perhaps that was for the better. She straightened her uniform, touched her bandaged arm for courage, and pushed through the kitchen door. Thomas stood with his back to her, still wearing his travel coat. Elizabeth saw her first, her eyes widening in recognition as pieces fell into place. Then Richard turned, his expression changing from confusion to understanding. "Thomas," Victoria said softly. He spun around, his face registering shock, disbelief, and dawning comprehension in rapid succession. "Victoria, what? How?" Margaret looked between them, her perfectly maintained composure cracking. "What is going on?" Thomas stepped toward Victoria, taking in her uniform, her simplified appearance, the bandage on her arm. "You're here. You've been here all along?" Victoria met his gaze steadily. "I needed to understand your world, to know your family as they truly are, not as they present themselves." "As a servant?" Margaret's voice rose sharply. "You deceived us? Infiltrated our home under false pretenses?" "Mother," Thomas started, but Victoria raised her hand. "Yes, Mrs. Harrison. I came here as a kitchen helper. I've spent weeks learning from Mrs. Walker, following Mrs. Phillips's instructions and observing your family's dynamics. I've seen kindness and cruelty, tradition and resistance to change, love and fear." Richard stepped forward. "I knew there was something familiar about you. The way you handled the burn at the dinner party. Your composure reminded me of someone, but I couldn't place it until Elizabeth showed me that magazine article." Elizabeth gasped. "You knew?" "I suspected," Richard replied, "and I began to understand why she might have chosen this approach." Margaret sank into a nearby chair, her face pale. All this time, our new kitchen girl was actually Thomas's girlfriend, the CEO, Mrs. Walker appeared in the kitchen doorway, her calm presence offering support. And a quick learner too, if I may say so. Despite her burned arm, she never missed a service. Thomas's head snapped up. "Burned arm? What happened?" The atmosphere in the hallway grew thick with tension as Victoria explained the incident at the dinner party. Thomas's expression darkened as she described Margaret's dismissal of her injury. "Mother, how could you?" "I didn't know who she was then," Margaret protested weakly. "Would it have mattered?" Thomas challenged. "Should it matter?" The silence that followed was broken only by the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The Harrison family moved to the drawing room, an uncomfortable tableau of shocked faces and tense postures. Victoria remained standing, still in her serving uniform, while Thomas positioned himself protectively beside her. "Perhaps we should all sit down," Richard suggested, his businessman's instincts seeking to restore order. "Clearly we have much to discuss." Mrs. Walker appeared with tea, her steady hands a sharp contrast to the trembling emotions in the room. As she served, she gave Victoria an encouraging nod. "I suppose," Margaret began, her voice tight, "you think very poorly of us now." Victoria considered her words carefully. "Actually, Mrs. Harrison, I think I understand you better than ever. I've seen how much you value tradition, order, and maintaining appearances, but I've also seen glimpses of the woman who used to bake with her children." Margaret's composure faltered. "You found the photo album?" "Yes, and I've heard stories from the staff about how this house used to be filled with laughter. What changed?" Richard cleared his throat. "Success changed us, I suppose. The higher we climbed, the more we feared falling. Margaret, my dear, we've spent so long protecting our position that we've forgotten how we got here in the first place." Elizabeth, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. "Is that why you did this?" she asked Victoria. "To expose our flaws?" "No," Victoria replied gently. "I did it because I loved Thomas, and I wanted to understand the family that shaped him. Yes, I've seen your flaws, but I've also seen your potential for change." Thomas squeezed her hand. "I should be angry that you went behind my back," he said softly, "but somehow I understand why you did it." "I must admit," Richard interjected, "it's rather impressive. Walking away from your company, learning to serve others, enduring Margaret's high standards. Not many CEOs would show such humility." Victoria smiled slightly. "I learned more in your kitchen than I have in many boardrooms." Mrs. Walker's lessons about service, timing, and attention to detail apply just as well to running a company as they do to running a household. Margaret sat straighter. "And what else did you learn about us during your investigation?" "I learned that Elizabeth has a kind heart beneath her social media facade," Victoria replied, watching the younger woman blush. "That Richard notices more than he lets on. That your perfectionism, Mrs. Harrison, comes from a deep desire to protect your family's position in society. And," she continued, touching her bandaged arm, "I learned that sometimes the worst injuries aren't physical ones. This household is full of invisible wounds, fear of inadequacy, pressure to maintain appearances, the weight of expectations." Thomas looked stricken. "I never realized. I've been away so much, focused on my own life." "We've all been focused on our own concerns," Richard acknowledged. Perhaps it took an outsider's perspective to show us what we've become. Elizabeth wiped her eyes. The way we treated you, even before we knew who you were. It was awful. Not everyone treated me badly, Victoria corrected. Mrs. Walker showed me kindness from the start. She taught me not just about cooking and service, but about dignity and resilience. Margaret stood abruptly and walked to the window. When she turned back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I remember when this house was different, when we cared more about family dinners than business connections, when Thomas and Elizabeth's laughter meant more than social standings. She faced Victoria directly. You must think me a terrible snob. I think you're a woman who lost her way trying to protect what she loved, Victoria replied. The question is, what will you do now that you see the cost of that protection? The room fell silent as Margaret considered this. Thomas watched his mother intently, while Richard and Elizabeth seemed to hold their breath. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice slightly unsteady. I suppose we begin by apologizing, not just to you, Victoria, but to each other. And perhaps we could start having those family dinners again, without the pretense this time. Victoria felt Thomas relax beside her. She thought of Mrs. Walker's words about grace under pressure and the power of truth to heal. The grandfather clock chimed softly in the hall, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Outside, the evening light painted the room in soft golds and shadows, a reminder that even the most difficult days eventually give way to new possibilities. The week following Victoria's revelation brought remarkable changes to the Harrison household. Gone was the rigid formality that had dominated family interactions for so long. In its place, tentative steps toward authenticity emerged. Margaret surprised everyone by appearing in the kitchen one morning, dressed more casually than Victoria had ever seen her. Mrs. Walker, she said, her voice carrying an unusual note of humility. I wonder if you might teach me how to make those cinnamon rolls Thomas loved as a child. Mrs. Walker's eyes crinkled with pleasure. Of course, madam. The recipe hasn't changed in 20 years. Victoria, who had stayed at the house at Thomas's insistence, watched as Margaret rolled up her sleeves and began measuring flour. The sight of her carefully manicured hands, covered in dough, spoke volumes about her commitment to change. Elizabeth, too, showed signs of transformation. She began spending less time on her phone and more time engaging with the family. One afternoon, Victoria found her in the garden with Jenny, learning about the different roses her mother had planted years ago. Did you know, Elizabeth shared over dinner that evening, that each of these rose varieties has a story? Mother planted the white ones when I was born, and the pink ones for Thomas. Margaret's eyes misted slightly. I'd almost forgotten that. We used to spend hours in that garden. Richard made his own adjustments. He began taking breakfast with the family instead of in his study, and his phone remained noticeably absent during meals. He even invited Victoria to join him one morning to discuss TechVision's latest innovations. Your artificial intelligence project could revolutionize elderly care, he noted, genuine interest replacing his former condescension. Have you considered partnering with healthcare providers? Thomas watched these changes with a mixture of amazement and hope. I never thought I'd see Father discussing business ideas with someone over breakfast, he confided to Victoria, let alone with my girlfriend in the family dining room. The staff, too, adapted to the shifting dynamics. Mrs. Phillips relaxed her rigid scheduling, while Mrs. Walker began sharing more of her recipes and wisdom with both Victoria and Margaret. The kitchen became a place of gathering rather than division. One evening, as Victoria prepared to return to her company, she found Mrs. Walker waiting in her room. You've done more than expose truth here, the cook said warmly. You've reminded them of who they used to be and shown them who they could become. Victoria hugged the woman who had become her mentor and friend. I learned as much from you as they did from me. The next morning, as Victoria packed her simple clothes alongside the uniform she'd worn for weeks, Margaret knocked on her door. I've been thinking, she said, sitting on Victoria's small bed, about what really matters in life. When Thomas first mentioned you, I was so focused on your background that I couldn't see your character. Victoria sat beside her. And now? Now I see a woman who cared enough about my son to humble herself, who showed more grace in a servant's role than I did as the lady of the house. Margaret touched Victoria's healing arm gently. I'm sorry for how I treated you, both as a servant and as Thomas's choice. Their conversation was interrupted by Elizabeth bursting in. "Father's calling everyone to the dining room. He says he has an announcement." They found Richard standing at the head of the table, Thomas beside him. The entire staff, at Richard's insistence, had also gathered. "For too long," Richard began, "this house has been divided between those who serve and those who are served. Victoria's presence has shown us the artificiality of that division. From now on, things will be different." He outlined changes, better working conditions for the staff, regular family meals that included Mrs. Walker and Mrs. Phillips, and a scholarship program for staff members who wished to pursue further education. "Additionally," he added, glancing at Victoria, "I've been inspired by your company's approach to innovation. I'd like to discuss ways we might collaborate to bring new technologies to traditional industries." Victoria caught Thomas's proud smile. This was more than just business. It was Richard's way of embracing change while honoring tradition. Later that evening, in the garden where Margaret's roses bloomed, Thomas took Victoria's hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For believing my family could change. For caring enough to take such a risk." He touched her healing burn. "For showing us all what real strength looks like." The setting sun painted the roses in shades of gold and pink, much like the photograph Victoria had found in that old album. But now, instead of representing a lost past, they seemed to promise a different future, one where tradition and progress, service and leadership could coexist in harmony. 3 months after Victoria's revelation, the Harrison household had evolved in ways none of its members could have predicted. The changes, though significant, came naturally, like a garden long overgrown, finally receiving proper care. Margaret's transformation proved the most remarkable. She began hosting weekly cooking sessions in the kitchen, where hierarchy disappeared in favor of shared learning and laughter. Mrs. Walker's patient guidance helped her rediscover the joy she'd once found in simple domestic arts. "You know," Margaret confided to Victoria during one such session, "I spent years thinking status came from maintaining distance. How wrong I was." Elizabeth, inspired by Victoria's example, made her own surprising announcement over Sunday lunch. "I've enrolled in business courses," she declared. "And I'm starting an internship at Tech Vision next month." The pride in Richard's eyes matched the surprise in Margaret's. "But darling, what about your social media career?" Elizabeth smiled. "I can do both, Mother. Victoria showed me that authenticity matters more than appearances." Richard, too, embraced change in his own way. He began implementing progressive policies in his company, inspired by Tech Vision's innovative approaches. The partnership he and Victoria developed became a model for combining traditional business wisdom with modern innovation. The staff witnessed these transformations with quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Walker, especially, took pride in how her kitchen had become the heart of family healing. "In all my years of service," she told Victoria during one of her frequent visits, "I've never seen such genuine change in a family. You planted the seeds, dear, but they're the ones choosing to help them grow." Even Mrs. Phillips relaxed her rigid protocols, though she still insisted on properly pressed newspapers for Richard's breakfast. Some traditions, they all agreed, were worth keeping. Thomas and Victoria's relationship deepened through these changes. They found strength in their shared vision of bridging worlds, old and new, tradition and innovation, service and leadership. One evening, as they walked through Margaret's rose garden, Thomas stopped beneath the arch where white and pink roses intertwined. "This spot," he said, "represents everything you've helped us become. Different blooms growing together, making something more beautiful than either could achieve alone." Victoria touched a perfect white blossom. "Your family had this potential all along. They just needed permission to change." "Speaking of change," Thomas smiled, reaching into his pocket. "I have a question for you." But before he could continue, Margaret's voice called from the kitchen, "Victoria, could you help me with this soufflé? I can't quite get it right." Thomas laughed. "My mother calling for help in the kitchen. I never thought I'd see the day." "We should go in," Victoria smiled. "A proper soufflé waits for no one, not even marriage proposals." Thomas's eyes widened. "How did you, CEO, remember? I noticed details." She kissed him softly. "And yes, by the way, but ask me properly after we save the soufflé." They found Margaret in the kitchen, flour on her cheek, being coached by Mrs. Walker. Elizabeth filmed the scene for her newly repurposed social media channel, which now focused on family relationships and authentic living. Richard watched from the doorway, his usual business phone nowhere in sight. As Victoria rolled up her sleeves to help, she caught Mrs. Walker's knowing wink. The cook had seen the ring box in Thomas's pocket earlier. Little escaped her notice in her kitchen. The evening turned into an impromptu celebration, with everyone helping to prepare dinner. Margaret insisted on making her newly perfected cinnamon rolls for dessert, while Elizabeth documented the family's collaborative cooking efforts. Later, when Thomas finally managed his official proposal in the garden, the entire household, family and staff alike, waited in the kitchen with champagne and Mrs. Walker's special celebration cake. "Two new beginnings," Richard toasted, looking around at the gathered faces. "And to the woman who showed us how to be a real family again." Victoria squeezed Thomas's hand, thinking of her first days in the kitchen, learning the proper way to polish silver and serve from the left. Those lessons in humility had led to something far more valuable than she'd ever expected. To family, she corrected gently, in all its forms. The kitchen, once a place of rigid hierarchy and division, echoed with genuine laughter. Outside, Margaret's roses bloomed in the moonlight, their mixed fragrance a sweet reminder that the best gardens grow when different flowers are allowed to flourish together. 5 years passed, bringing with them the kind of changes that could only be appreciated with time's perspective. The Harrison mansion, once a monument to rigid tradition, had transformed into a warm family home where old elegance merged seamlessly with modern life. Victoria stood in the kitchen, now modernized but still maintaining its heart, watching Mrs. Walker teach her 4-year-old daughter Rose how to roll pastry dough. The little girl's dark curls bounced as she concentrated on the task, her small hands covered in flour. "Gently now, young miss," Mrs. Walker instructed, her hair now completely silver but her eyes as bright as ever. "Just like your grandmother does it." From the doorway came Margaret's laugh. "Though your grandmother still hasn't quite mastered the perfect crust after all these years." The relationship between grandmother and granddaughter had proved one of the most beautiful transformations. Margaret, freed from the constraints of social expectations, had become the kind of grandmother who thought nothing of getting flour on her designer clothes while baking with Rose. Elizabeth entered the kitchen, tablet in hand, but not glued to it. As TechVision's new head of public relations, she had found her true calling, combining social media expertise with genuine business acumen. Her weekly family dinner posts had spawned a movement promoting authentic family connections across social classes. "The documentary crew will be here tomorrow," she announced. They're quite excited about featuring the scholarship program in their series about corporate social responsibility. The program, born from Richard's promise 5 years ago, had already helped several staff members' children pursue higher education. Jenny, the former gardener's assistant, was now completing her master's degree in environmental science. Mrs. Phillips appeared with her usual impeccable timing. "Mr. Harrison asked me to remind everyone about the celebration dinner this evening, though I doubt anyone has forgotten." Indeed, no one had forgotten. The dinner would mark multiple milestones: the 5th anniversary of the scholarship program, Mrs. Walker's 40th year with the family, and the official announcement of Elizabeth's engagement to a young chef she'd met through her family dinner blog. Victoria smiled, remembering her own engagement dinner in this kitchen. So much had changed since then, yet the heart of what made this house special remained the same: the people who filled it with life and love. Thomas came in carrying their youngest, 3-month-old James, who had his father's eyes and his mother's determined expression. "Someone's refusing to nap unless Grandma Margaret sings to him," he announced. Margaret eagerly took her grandson, her perfectly manicured nails a stark contrast to his tiny, grasping fingers. The sight of her singing softly while swaying in the kitchen would have been unthinkable 6 years ago. "Hard to believe there was a time when I thought the kitchen wasn't a proper place for the family," she mused, catching Victoria's eye. Richard appeared last, having finally mastered the art of leaving work at a reasonable hour. "I just got off the phone with the board. They've unanimously approved the expansion of the scholarship program to all our company's branches." The news was met with joy but not surprise. The Harrison family had become known for their progressive approach to corporate responsibility, largely inspired by their own transformation. Victoria watched as Rose proudly showed her grandfather the slightly lopsided pastry she'd made. Richard picked up his granddaughter, uncaring of the flour that dusted his bespoke suit. "You know," Mrs. Walker said quietly to Victoria, "when you first arrived in this kitchen, I never imagined we'd be here 5 years later, though I had my hopes." Victoria hugged the woman who had become like a second mother to her. "You saw the truth from the beginning, didn't you? I saw a young woman brave enough to step down from her position to understand another's world. The rest," Mrs. Walker smiled, watching the family interact, "was just ingredients finding their proper mixture." The kitchen filled with the warm scent of baking pastries and the sounds of family conversation. Outside, the garden bloomed with roses, old and new, each variety carefully tended by Margaret and Jenny's collaborative efforts. As Victoria watched her daughter attempt to teach her baby brother how to clap, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Every mistake, every moment of discomfort, every truth revealed, had been necessary steps toward this new reality. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 5, its familiar sound now a comfort rather than a mandate. Soon, the house would fill with guests celebrating their shared accomplishments. But for now, in the kitchen where it all began, the family savored their simple moment together. The evening of the celebration dinner arrived, bringing with it a sense of completion. The Harrison mansion sparkled with lights, its rooms filled with a mix of family, friends, staff members past and present, and scholarship recipients. In the transformed kitchen, now a state-of-the-art space that still maintained its cozy heart, Victoria helped Mrs. Walker put the finishing touches on the evening's dessert. They worked in comfortable silence, their movements synchronized by years of shared experience. "Do you ever regret it?" Mrs. Walker asked suddenly. "Taking such a risk with your deception?" Victoria considered the question as she piped delicate decorations onto the celebration cake. "Not the deception itself, that was necessary at the time, but I regret that it was necessary at all. Though looking at everything now," she gestured to the bustling house around them, "I'd say it was worth it." The dining room table, extended to its full length, sat 30 people comfortably. Gone were the days of separate staff dining. Tonight, Mrs. Walker would sit beside Margaret, their shared love of cooking having bridged the gap between their former positions. Mrs. Phillips would take her place near Richard, their mutual appreciation for order and tradition having formed an unlikely friendship. Elizabeth's fiancé, Michael, had insisted on contributing to the menu, his innovative culinary creations sitting comfortably alongside Mrs. Walker's classic dishes. His presence in the kitchen had initially surprised the family, but his genuine passion for food and family had won them over completely. As guests arrived, Victoria watched the easy interaction between different social circles. Scholarship recipients chatted comfortably with Richard about their studies and future plans. Margaret shared gardening tips with Jenny, who had become an expert in sustainable garden design. Rose flitted between guests in her party dress, proudly introducing herself as Mrs. Walker's youngest apprentice. Baby James, secure in Thomas's arms, observed the proceedings with wide-eyed wonder. When everyone was seated, Richard rose to speak. His voice carried clearly through the room, though his usual businesslike tone had softened with emotion. 5 years ago, our family learned an invaluable lesson about the true meaning of worth. We learned it through the courage of one woman who dared to show us our own prejudices, and through the wisdom of those who had served our family faithfully for years. He gestured to Mrs. Walker and Mrs. Phillips. These women, and many others, weren't just our staff. They were our teachers, though we didn't know it then. They taught us about dignity, about service, about the real meaning of family. Margaret stood next to her husband, her eyes bright. We also celebrate 40 years of Mrs. Walker's dedication to this household. Though dedication seems too formal a word now, love might be more appropriate. Mrs. Walker dabbed at her eyes with her napkin as Margaret continued. This kitchen, which I once considered merely a service area, has become the heart of our home. It's where we gather, where we learn, where we grow together. Elizabeth raised her glass. To family, in all its forms and functions. To love that transcends social boundaries, and to truth that transforms rather than divides. As the evening progressed, Victoria found a quiet moment in the garden with Thomas. The rose bushes Margaret had planted for their wedding day bloomed alongside the historic varieties, creating a beautiful blend of old and new. Sometimes I wonder, Thomas mused, What would have happened if you hadn't taken that risk? If you'd just come to dinner as the successful CEO? Victoria watched through the window as Rose helped Mrs. Walker serve dessert, the little girl's face a picture of concentration. Then we wouldn't have this story to tell our children, about how love can change people when truth is served with grace. Inside, the sound of laughter filtered through the open windows. Margaret was sharing the story of her first attempted soufflé, with Mrs. Walker providing humorous commentary. Richard and Mrs. Phillips debated the merits of modern versus traditional table settings, while Elizabeth filmed Michael teaching Rose the proper way to hold a piping bag. The scene embodied everything Victoria had hoped for when she first stepped into this kitchen 6 years ago, not the erasure of social distinctions, but the recognition that true worth lay in character rather than position. As they rejoined the party, Victoria paused in the kitchen doorway. This room, where her journey had begun, now stood as a testament to the power of understanding, the strength of humility, and the transformative nature of love. The grandfather clock struck 10, its chimes mixing with the sounds of joy and conversation. In this moment, surrounded by the family she had helped create, not just by marriage but by truth and transformation, Victoria knew that some risks were always worth taking. The kitchen, once a place of division, had become a sanctuary of unity. And in that unity, they had all found something far more valuable than social status or traditional roles. They had found their true selves and each other.